Just a quick update on what the situation is in relation to the campaigns you've seen illustrated in this film. So since this film was made, a number of things have happened. One was hinted at the end. So what we've seen across many states is the template for the laws that have been introduced being copied and then used to introduce similar laws that, for example, say you cannot have a contract with a state if you are campaigning for gun laws. So if you oppose America's gun laws, then you cannot have a contract with a state. Some states have introduced laws that say if you are campaigning for abortion rights, you have to sign a pledge you will not do that before you have a contract for a state. And there have also been laws introduced saying if you are campaigning for fossil fuel divestment, then you cannot have a contract with a state. So what Lara Friedman was talking about in the film, as this is a very dangerous precedent, has now been established in reality. The other update is that the successful outcome in Arkansas, so that's the case with the newspaper, was overturned. So that went to a higher court who ruled that it was not unconstitutional, but that case is now going all the way to the Supreme Court. So this is very soon, I think it's anticipated sometime in 2024, is going to end up in the Supreme Court. But what we're seeing here, what the film is illustrating, is part of what is a global effort by Israel to delegitimize the Palestinian liberation struggle, to delegitimize advocacy for Palestinian rights and campaigning for Palestinian rights, but very, very specifically and targeting to delegitimize the Palestinian call for a campaign of boycott, divestment and sanctions against Israel until it stops its violation of Palestinian rights. And that's been conducted through what's called lawfare. So what we've seen illustrated, the attempt to get willing allies to introduce laws that in lots of different ways seek to try to prescribe, try to prevent support for BDS. So we've seen, as the film showed, 35 US states introduce such laws. We've seen similar actions happening in France and in Germany, with regulations passed through the federal parliament there. And we're seeing the same thing happening here in the UK. Now, the very first attempt made here in the UK was in 2016-17, when the UK government tried to pass regulations attached to existing pension laws. So they introduced regulations that said that basically tried to prohibit local government pension schemes. So these are the pension schemes run by local authority that invest the funds of local authority workers, and it tried to prevent them making decisions to divest from companies that were complicit in Israel's violation of the rights of Palestinians. Also tried to prevent them divesting from the defense industry, from the arms industry. You'll know that we at the Palestine Solidarity Campaign took the government to court. Many of you were involved in that struggle, and we eventually won in the Supreme Court after a battle over 2 years. So in 2019, the incoming Boris Johnson government made clear that it would try to bring in new legislation effectively to overturn that judgment. And we won on the basis, on the narrow basis, that the government did not have the power, did not have the legal power to do what it was doing. So the government said, okay, we will introduce a new law that will give us that power. So we've been anticipating that bill since 2019. It was finally tabled in July of this year. It goes by the unwieldy name of the Economic Activities of Public Bodies, brackets Overseas Matters Bill, but we are all calling it what it is, which is the Anti-boycott bill. Now, it works differently from the bills that you have just seen illustrated in the US, and there is one important point, because one of the things that's behind these attempts is both to try to introduce laws that in some way actually prohibit support for BDS, but also to create a chilling effect, to make people frightened, to make people feel that it's a toxic activity or something they should be worried about undertaking. And you will see a lot of rhetoric from the government at the moment saying it is bringing in a law to criminalise BDS. It won't do that. So many of you, I hope, are participating in BDS campaigns we're running at the moment. We have campaigns targeting Puma because of its complicity through its sponsorship of the Israeli Football Association. There's a campaign targeting Barclays banks. Many of you will be outside the bank regularly. This law does not touch those activities. It does not prohibit your right to be on the streets calling for people not to invest, not to have an account with Barclays because of its complicity. What it targets is public bodies. So that means local authorities, universities. And what it seeks to do, what the law says is, a public body cannot make a decision not to procure from or not to invest in a company based on political or moral disapproval of the act of a foreign state. Now what does that mean? Well, what that means is, you want to go to Brent Council, and if you want to say, we don't think you should be investing in companies that are complicit in the violation of human rights or international law, and here's a list of some companies, and here's a company you're investing in and that's complicit, let's say, for example, in China's violation of the rights of the Uyghur people, well, you couldn't take, the public body, Brent Council, would be prohibited by this law from taking that action. This will also affect if you are wanting to go and argue, for example, for divestment from a company that is complicit, let's say for sake of argument, was complicit in the actions of the Brazilian government in terms of deforestation of the Amazon, you could not take that action either, or they could not make a decision to divest because that could be argued to be based on disapproval of the actions of a foreign state. So this will have very, very wide-ranging implications. It will affect a whole range of legitimate campaigns for social and climate justice, although as I say, as I'll illustrate, its main target is the Palestinian call for BDS against Israel, but it will affect a whole range of campaigns. And that is why we have been able to pull together a coalition of more than 70 organisations who are publicly standing up in opposition to this bill. They include over a dozen trade unions. They include faith groups, the Quakers, the Methodist Church, the Muslim Association of Britain, the Jewish Diaspora Alliance. They include climate justice organisations, Greenpeace, Friends of the Earth, Liberty, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International. All of them are in agreement with us that this bill is a threat to democratic freedoms, a threat to local democracy, a threat to freedom of expression, and undermines the basic principle that public bodies should practice ethical investment policies. Now, in illustrating the threat to freedom of expression, there are some quite extraordinary draconian clauses in this bill. So there is a clause that says if you are a responsible person in a public body, let's say, for example, you're the head of a council, or you're the head of the finance department that's making decisions about pension divestment, you cannot publicly state that you would take action to divest, but you are prevented from doing so because of this bill. What does that mean? So it means, let's say, the next council elections, you're going to a hustings, you're putting questions, and you say to a prospective council leader, I'm very concerned that this council continues to invest in this company that's complicit in violations of international law, and I want you to commit that you will ensure that the council divests. And if that council leader says, I absolutely agree with you, I don't think we should be doing that, I think that's wrong, however, we are prohibited from doing so by this law, he would be or she would be in violation of the law and subject to a penalty under the terms of the law for making a public statement of opposition to the law. So this is an extraordinary piece of legislation that has that direct impact on freedom of expression. Now, because of all of those clauses, because of the body of opposition we have been able to build, we are mounting quite serious opposition in Parliament. This passed through its second reading. Every opposition party, there's a slight caveat when it comes to the Labour Party, which I'll explain, but every opposition party has committed to oppose this bill. There is opposition from within the Tory ranks, and we are expecting significant opposition when it comes back to the House of Lords. Now, what's the caveat in relation to the Labour Party? Well, at the second reading of the bill, the Labour Party abstained, but said it will vote against it at the third reading unless the government meets all of its objections. Why is it prevaricating on this? Why is it prevaricating? Well, it's prevaricating because of what is the main target of this bill, which is the Palestinian campaign for boycott, divestment and sanctions. The government has made that very clear. Although this is broad, although it will affect a whole range of campaigns in terms of how it's been written, the government's made it very clear from point A, the reason we're doing this is to stop these pernicious boycotts of Israel. It said that in the rhetoric associated with the bill. It said it is an impact assessment, and if anyone was left in any doubts, it's put in a very specific clause in the bill. It is a clause that treats Palestinians by a different standard than any other oppressed people in the world calling for boycott. So this clause says, there's a feature in the bill that says you cannot divest because of political or moral disapproval of a foreign state, but the government can, by introducing separate regulations, allow divestment from certain states if it chooses to do so. The government's already said if we pass this, if this gets through, we will immediately introduce regulations that say if any public body wants to take action to divest from Russia because of its illegal invasion and occupation of Ukraine, they will be able to do that. But there is a special clause that says there is one state in the world that no government minister can ever introduce regulations to allow divestment from, and that is Israel. Why is the Labour Party so prevaricating over this? Because the argument being used is the same one underpinning all of these global attempts to introduce such laws. Same arguments being used in the US, that calling for boycott, divestment and sanctions against Israel is anti-Semitic. Why? Because Israel is a Jewish state, and secondly, because the Palestinian call for BDS only calls for boycott, divestment and sanctions against Israel. It doesn't simultaneously call for boycott, divestment and sanctions of any other rights abusing state. Now this is a really pernicious argument. It's pernicious for two reasons. One, it is based on anti-Semitic foundations. What it does is conflate the Jewish people with the state of Israel, and it says that the Jewish people are homogenous and all have the same political views and all have an approving view of the actions of the Israeli state. That is quite straightforwardly not true, and there are Jewish groups, including some that will surprise you, the Union of Jewish Students, YACAD, who are standing in opposition to this bill. Secondly, though, the reason why that's a pernicious argument is that it treats Palestinians by a different standard. Imagine trying to make an argument that black South Africans in the 70s and 80s, when they called for boycott, divestment and sanctions against the white South African regime, must have been motivated by hatred of white South Africans or white people more generally, because they were not simultaneously calling for boycott of Indonesia because of its oppression of the people of East Timor. This treats Palestinians by a different standard. It says, if you, like other oppressed people, call for action against your oppressor, non-violent, legitimate action, then we will presume you are motivated by racist motivations. So we need to oppose this bill. The opposition to it is building. There is a significant chance of defeating it. The mathematics in the Commons are against us. To win in the Commons, we would need 40 Conservative MPs to rebel. That is not going to happen. But there is a significant possibility, if we can continue to mount the pressure on the government, that this bill will die in the House of Lords. And part of that is the timetable that the government is running on. So this bill now, we are being informed, it could come back for its third reading in October. The latest intelligence, it's speculative, is it's probably not going to come back until 2024, but we're working on the basis of being ready for it to come back in October, but it probably won't be to 2024. It will pass its third reading, but then it goes to the House of Lords. And we are anticipating and working with allies and fomenting a whole body of amendments and obstructions to be laid down in the Lords. So the pressure we put on MPs at the moment, the pressure we put on Lords matters. And we are building momentum. Some of you would have seen a few weeks ago a motion passed at the TUC that both reaffirmed the full opposition, unanimous opposition of the trade union movement to the law, but also included a clause that says the trade union movement rejects any attempt to say that uniquely the Palestinian people do not have the right to call for boycott, divestment and sanctions. You will have seen a few weeks ago the Scottish Government made clear it will not give consent to this bill. So under the devolved formula, the government should not be able to introduce a bill in Scotland if it is actually a bill that comes under the powers of the devolved authority, and they say we will not consent to this bill. And today we were able to announce that the Welsh Government has done the same. So unless the government now wants a major constitutional battle on its hands, this bill is already on the way to not being able to become law in Wales and in Scotland. So we've got to basically, and let's take some inspirations from those extraordinary activists we saw in the States. We've got to fight this. We've got to stop this bill. And the timescale for that is the next few months. So the things I want us to talk about in the next session is what you can do. There's an event coming up on October the 3rd. I'd like to encourage you all to be there. We're having an online rally. We have a number of MPs from cross parties who will be attending. They will be illustrating the arguments and what they're planning to do to try to stop this bill becoming law. On October the 7th, we've got a national day of action, and we are asking people, and across the coalition, we're asking all the coalition members, all of those organisations I've listed, to take some form of action that day. If they have members, we're asking them to mobilise their members. If they're not organisations that work like that, we're asking them to put out videos, put out statements. So we have a day when we are demonstrating a nationwide body of opposition to this law. This is a fight that is difficult, but it's one that we think is winnable. So we now need to put energy into making sure we are protecting the space to do what is legitimate. And one final thing I will say, which was illustrated in the film. Boycott is a form of political activity with a noble tradition. Many of you will be veterans of the struggle against South African apartheid. And many of you will remember Nelson Mandela, when he visited Britain, making the point, not only was it the activism of anti-apartheid activists that mattered and gave succour and solace and put the necessary pressure on the South African regime, he made a specific point of saying the importance of the action that public bodies took place. Now, many people have made the point to me, well, if this law had existed in the 1980s, then that would have been impossible. Public bodies would have not been able to do that. Actually, the answer I give to that is there's only one precedent in the UK for a government trying to do something like this, and that was in the 1980s, and that was Margaret Thatcher's government trying to introduce a similar law to stop public bodies taking action against South African apartheid. She failed. She was on the wrong side of history then. The Conservative government now is on the wrong side of history, so we need to make sure we defeat them.